Sejam todos bem-vindos ao sexto Nas Nuvens. É um grande prazer começar essa live com a abertura do Congresso. Então, em nome da direção, da coordenação do Congresso, em nome da professora Edith Rocha e da equipe de coordenação, nós todos damos boas-vindas a todos e todas e esperamos que vocês aproveitem bastante toda a programação que vai acontecer a partir de hoje. Gostaríamos de dizer que essa live, essa conversa está sendo gravada e vai ser legendada depois, vão ser colocadas as legendas em português, porque a live vai acontecer em inglês, não vamos ter tradução simultânea, ok? Então, vocês vão assistir agora em inglês e mais para frente vamos ter, então, a disponibilização do vídeo com as legendas, ok? Então, gostaria muito de apresentar a todos a nossa convidada de hoje para essa abertura, que é a Professor Lucy Green, da Inglaterra, que foi professora durante muitos anos no Instituto de Educação, Institute of Education, da University College of London, atualmente, da Universidade de Londres. E a professora Lucy Green é uma pessoa muito, muito importante na área de sociologia da educação musical. Ela é professora emérita do Instituto de Educação. E ela vai conversar aqui sobre vários pontos com relação ao trabalho dela como pesquisadora na área de sociologia, da educação musical, e vai contar um pouco algumas coisas desse processo dela, ok? Então, gostaria imensamente de agradecer a presença dela, e agora eu vou começar a falar, então, em inglês com ela. Lucy, thank you so much for being here. We welcome you in this conference, and we hope we can have a nice conversation, and I'd like to really say a big thank you for accepting this invitation. It's an honor, it's a great pleasure to have you with us.
And I want to say a huge thank you to you and Edith and the organisers of the conference for inviting me. It's a great honour to be here. And as you know, Heloísa, I've been to Brazil quite a few times. I have many, many wonderful Brazilian friends and colleagues, of which you are obviously one. And it's just so nice to be able to communicate with my Brazilian friends and colleagues again. Thank you for inviting me.
Good. So I'd like to start this conversation asking you to talk a little bit about your career as a researcher in this field of sociology of music education. So actually, how has been your inspiration? How the main topics came to you? You know, how is your main interest in the field of sociology of music education?
Well, I think we discussed about how we were going to run this, and you mentioned that perhaps I should talk about each one of my books. So perhaps what I can do is address that question in relation to the books one by one. They all have the question about how did the ideas for the research come to me has kind of one answer, because in a way it's the same answer for all the books. In each case, the idea came to me out of nowhere and through putting together things that maybe weren't connected and seeing that there's a gap there. So let me explain that in more concrete terms. I had an experience when I was about 15, and I often come back to this experience in my mind because I can trace the beginnings of a lot of my research to that experience. I went with a group of friends to a hall. It was a group of boys who all played in a rock band, and they rehearsed during the afternoon, and then there was some kind of a party afterwards. And I sat on the floor cross-legged, because this was in about 1971 or 2. I sat on the floor and watched them rehearsing their rock music. And at that time, I was a quite advanced pianist, classically trained at school. And so I had quite a lot of musical knowledge and skills for my age. And yet I felt, watching these boys on stage playing their rock instruments, that I didn't have a clue what they were doing or how they did it. And I don't think I could articulate it at a conscious level at the time. But somewhere in my mind was the question, how is it that I've had all this music education and they haven't really had any? And how is it that they're doing something that I wouldn't know what to do if I was to get up on the stage and join them at that time in my life? I wouldn't have known how to join in with what they were doing. So out of this, actually, in a sense, has come all my books. To jump ahead to the first book, Music on Deaf Ears, that came from being at Teacher Education College. I did a Bachelor of Education course. So it was a 4-year degree and it included qualification as a teacher. But essentially it was what we call here a dual honours degree. I studied education studies, philosophy, psychology and sociology of education, and I studied music, the usual things, analysis, history, orchestration, performance, conducting, and so forth. And we did a little bit of something called curriculum studies. I never understood what that was, actually, but that was supposed to be the music education section. But mainly the music education studies were going into schools and trying to teach them music. That was it. There wasn't really a subject at that time. I'm talking now about 1975. There wasn't such a subject as music education. There was no master's course in the UK, and I'm not even sure if there was one in the States in music education. So basically, I was studying education and I was studying music as two completely separate things. And I became very interested, particularly in the sociology of education, and particularly questions of equality, inclusion, of how education reproduces wealth and privilege and also reproduces poverty. And I could see that there was a connection between this and between music education. And at that time, only one person that I knew of, Graham Vulliamy, who was a sociologist who wrote three wonderful chapters about the sociology of music. Sorry, the sociology of education and bringing it to the music classroom. And he influenced me a lot. I went to see him. He was a very nice man, but for various reasons, I couldn't study with him. And it was around this time, for the first time in my life, I began to realize I'm interested in intellectual things. I'd never had been at school. I was a naughty girl. I didn't pay attention. I didn't do particularly well. I went to teacher training college without any particular expectation of anything. And it was in the 3rd year of the course I began to realize I was really excited about ideas. So the first book came out of putting together the sociology of education with what happens in music education. And I looked in that book, it was my PhD, of course, then it became my first book. I looked at how music education appears to give equal opportunities to all children to succeed in music, but how, in fact, it is reproducing existing inequalities.
Mm-hmm. And okay, you tell me about the first book, and then carry on with this process.
I just don't want to go on and on and on. If you want to stop me at any point, if I'm talking too much.
Oh, that's okay. How you became a lecturer at IOE, and then all this process of carry on with all the research that result in other books. So
Yeah.
tell about the story. You know, this story is very interesting.
That my PhD I did between I did a master's in music at Sussex University, and then, as I say, there were no masters in music education that you could do, and so I then brought my musical and my educational knowledge together, and I sort of created my own PhD in music education. I had one supervisor in music and one supervisor in education. And then I worked in schools for 6 years. And during my postgraduate studies, I taught the piano. So that was a very good experience. Then I worked in schools for 6 years, and it was during those 6 years that the thesis came out as a book. I sent it to 6 publishers. They all rejected it. Many of them said, it's very, very good, but we haven't got a list. You know, publishers like to have lists, and they have books that fit on their list. A lot of them said, look, we can't publish this because it's neither music nor is it education. It cuts between the two. So it was actually for that very reason that it was rejected. Anyway, eventually I found a publisher who published it, and while I was still a school teacher, it came out. And then I got my job at the Institute, which was for me a dream job. And so my second book is on gender and music education, and it has a similar angle to it. How does the music education system reproduce not only ideas about gender, but actually how does it produce gendered activities through music? And in my first book, I developed a theory of musical meaning, which I found helpful for thinking about what's going on in classrooms and other music education settings. And in my second book, it came to me to this theory, which was all about sort of musical meaning in relation to value, musical style, and how schools reproduce musical values through making classical music appear to be so much superior and popular music to appear inferior. And I then realized I could apply the same theory to gender. It seems obvious, really, but it took me a long time to realize that. I worked it out. I remember being on a long car journey and this idea becoming very excited. And then, of course, I could see, well, actually, you could apply the theory of musical meaning to anything, to gender, to race, to sexuality, whatever. But so I applied it to gender in that second book. And I wrote that, yes, in my first few years at the Institute of Education. And I can also trace how that book came about back to that experience that I mentioned earlier with the rock band, because not only was I sitting there thinking about the musical skills that they had and that I didn't have, thinking about the way that I had had a musical education and they hadn't, and yet they were the ones who were playing. But also, of course, I was a girl and they were all boys. And although at that time there were fantastic female pop musicians, Joni Mitchell, I was a great lover of her music and I still am. And there were singers like Joan Baez, singer-songwriters like Carole King. But at that stage, we've gone back again to about 1971, 72, I'd never seen or heard of a female playing an electric guitar or a drum kit in a rock band. And so I sat there on the floor and watched these boys, and I just felt not only would I not know what to do musically if I got up on the stage, but it would be outrageous. Girls just didn't play those instruments in those settings. And again, this idea, it was a semi-conscious thing that stayed with me for many years, and I found myself revisiting. And again, that was the basis for my second book on gender and music education, basically.
Mm-hmm. Very nice, very interesting. And then, I just want to cover a bit these publications, the ones that are really remarkable and the kind of turning point for us, everybody that are in music education. So carry on. After that, and then
so then
the next
as you know, my next book is called How Popular Musicians Learn. And that, again, obviously can be traced back to that same experience. Me sitting on the floor watching this group of boys playing their rock instruments and wondering how they learned to do it, and wondering why I couldn't do it. I couldn't play by ear. I couldn't, I couldn't understand what was going on there at all, really. And a lot of this actually comes from my dear husband, Charlie Ford, who, of course, you know very well as a friend, Heloísa. Charlie, who's 7 years older than me, was one of those fortunate youngsters who in sort of 1967, 68, 69 played both classical music and popular music. His instrument was the flute. And at that time, flute was actually a very popular, very common instrument in Anglo-American sort of folk pop kind of hippie music. And he played in a lot of bands and things like that, doing ear playing with guitars and so forth. And he also learned to play the classical flute and a little bit of classical piano. And he, throughout our relationship, which started in 1979, he often said to me, I learned more at school, I learned more about music when we had the breaks at lunchtime, and we used to go to a room where there was a piano, and a friend of mine showed me a minor ninth chord. And, that was the beginning of the learning process. And, I learned more from my friends than from my teachers. And this is, of course, the theme of How Popular Musicians Learn. And so how the idea for that book came to me was through an amalgam of all the questions I had already looked at, starting with the experience of sitting on the floor listening to the boys playing rock, the first book, the second book, and living with Charlie, who kept saying this to me. And eventually I thought, okay, right, look, this is ridiculous. I need to find out systematically, not anecdotally, but from a point of view of systematic research, how popular musicians themselves describe their own learning practices. So that was also something that came from a gap. There was a gap in the literature there. And when I set out doing the book, like all my books, I didn't know it was going to be a book. I've never set out to write a book ever. The books create themselves as I go into the questions that interest me. They always start out as just a little interesting question that I'm going to examine. Then I do a bit of research, I collect some data, and I think, wow, this is exciting. And then I think, maybe I'll write an article about this. And then, I start to think a few months, year, two down the line, there's 2 articles here. No, there's 3 articles here. And then I see, actually, this has got to be a book. And that's how all of them have started.
So you never thought that these books will be a big hit that will reach so many people and change so many ways of thinking in music education? Never, ever.
I never even thought they would be books when I started them. And I never set out to write a book. Again, I don't know why that is, but I think research has to come from the heart. And okay, I know today a lot of people are under a great deal of pressure to do research, to publish, and maybe they're in a position to a feeling that they have to have original ideas, they have to find something. And I feel very grateful that I was never under that pressure, because by the time that kind of governmental pressure happened to me, I was writing. I didn't, it was what I would have done anyway. But I think it's wrong, frankly. I know we're going slightly off the subject here. I'll get back to my other books, but I think it's wrong of governments to force people to do research. You can sit there and think, what shall I research about? Oh, God, shall I do this? No, shall I do that? I mean, that's what I'm like when I'm trying to decide what to cook for dinner, right? Research shouldn't be forced upon people. People should be given the freedom, the time to consider, to think, to learn, to experiment, to communicate with each other, to read, without the feeling they've got to write something. And then when that pressure is not on you, you have experiences. And from these experiences start little germs, which begin to develop slowly into something that becomes research. Yeah. So that's how it happened in all those cases, yeah.
That's wonderful, because this phrase you said, it has to come from your heart. That's always my feeling with you. I mean, being your student, you were my supervisor, and then I always understood that, seeing you doing it. And then it's interesting to see how it unfolds, you know. And for instance, following the How Popular Musicians Learn, which is a big hit, important book, important, turning point. It came the pedagogy, the informal learning in the classroom, and then it influenced so much other projects like Música Futures, for instance. So yeah. I'd like to hear a little bit about this consequence, you know, how it unfolded to so many wonderful things afterwards.
Well, as I was saying, in the first place, I didn't expect it to be a book, but I thought maybe if I'm going to pursue it, I started interviewing musicians. I thought maybe I'll have to interview 50 or 100 musicians, but even after 6 people, the data were repeating themselves. And so within sociological method, as you know, that's considered fine. I carried on for another 8 people, and I was just getting the same data over and over again. So I only interviewed a very small sample of people, but it wouldn't have mattered. I'm very confident that if I had interviewed 1,400 people instead of 14 people, I would have got the same results within the limited Anglo-American sphere of rock and pop music that I was working in. And but each time I can remember so clearly going to the interviews on the bus, you know, through the rain in drizzly, cold London, and turning up at somebody's house and saying, thank you very much for doing this. And, you know, sitting down with the tape recorder on and thinking, this is going nowhere. I thought that was all my work. This is going nowhere. This is not interesting. It's totally boring. But I carried on. The data were repeating themselves. And then when I start to look at the data, start to analyze it, I begin to see exciting things. And that's the way that happened with that, and also with all my work, actually. And so the one you were asking me about, did I expect the book to be a hit? I was very afraid that the book would be ridiculed, actually, because I thought in particular that popular musicians themselves, if any of them ever came across the book, would think it was absolutely ridiculous idea to write down how popular musicians learn, you know. But in fact, it was the opposite. I would say out of all the readerships of the book, the group who have been the most enthusiastic has been popular musicians themselves. And the reason for that is that people have said to me, well, yeah, of course, some people said to me, you've written my life. I've actually had, sounds like I'm boasting now, I don't mean to, but I was very touched. I've had men in their 50s in conference papers coming up to me and afterwards and saying, I was in tears, you wrote my life, you know? So what I think attracted them to this was that somebody had written it down. That was all. You know, it was nothing great that I did. I just asked them, and I put together a pattern that I saw in the answers, and I wrote it down. And they said that's what's so good about it, because nobody else has ever paid any attention to how we learned. It didn't count as proper learning. And so that was the group I thought would like the book the least. I think they liked it the most. And then, of course, sorry, I sometimes get distracted. The people are sending me these lovely notices on the bottom of the screen, but I'm getting distracted.
Yeah, you're students.
Very
people from other countries, Spain, Peru. Yeah, we're going to look at that later.
Yes, we'll look at them. Yes, please. So I've forgotten where I was. Yes, and when I think How Popular Musicians Learn, I sent a draft of it to a colleague and friend of mine, Richard Middleton, who is a very great thinker and musicologist, and has written one of the first serious books on musicological understandings of popular music, Studying Popular Music, it's called. And I sent him a draft of How Popular Musicians Learn. And I had a drink with him in a pub. We were at a meeting or something, and he said to me, "Oh, it's really nice. I like the book, but how are you going to translate this into practice?" And my heart sank. I thought, oh my God, I haven't got to translate it into practice as well, have I? I'm tired. So, but I could see what he meant. So at the last chapter of that book, I began to think about and put forward some ideas for how the knowledge of popular musicians learning could possibly be put into a music education. Excuse me, I think my dogs want to. You all right? Oh, yes. I forgot.
The two dogs, adorable.
Two dogs.
Lovely, they're lovely.
And then How Popular Musicians came out. It seemed to be quite successful. And so I really started putting my mind to the question that Richard had asked me, how does this translate into practice? And again, you know, I've always found when I finished a book, I have a period of not doing any research. I feel satiated. I feel satisfied. I don't want to do any research. I've always said that's the last book I'm writing. Yeah, you've heard me say that. And I mean it. But I was walking along the river one day, beside the river, with my dogs, just thinking about nothing in particular. And this idea began to form in my mind of a way to implement popular musicians learning practices in school classrooms. It began to just sort of, it was just like a little seed in the brain, and it just developed. And then I could see it's blindingly simple. And I don't use the word blindingly simple in disrespect to people who are blind or visually impaired, but actually quite the opposite, that sometimes people can see more when they are blind than seeing people. So I found it is blindingly simple. Of course, all you have to do is put the children into small groups and reenact the main aspects of the popular music learning practices. Let them choose their own music, let them work with their friends, let them choose their own instruments, let them try and play it by ear, and don't interfere for a while at least. Let them choose the song that they want to choose, the instrument that they let them find out how to play the instrument by trying rather than by showing them. And that, as you know, was the basis of my fourth book, Music, Informal Learning in the School. And those four books are the ones that I consider to be my main pieces of work. There are two more books after that, and a couple of edited books, which I'll certainly tell you about. But those four are the ones that create my sort of oeuvre.
Yeah, and influence projects, like I said before, like Musical Futures, and has been influencing many other researchers as well. So this is important.
Yes. Again, I had absolutely no idea. I started off this I had an idea. I wasn't writing a book. It's the same thing again. I had an idea that I could try this system that I'd thought of, going to a school. I went into the school of one of our master's students who kindly let me in, and I tried out the ideas. And his name was Paul Newman. He was actually very open to the ideas, and he began to be quite excited about it, which gave me confidence. So I managed to get a very small amount of funding. I went into 3 other schools in London and tried the methods out there. And again, the teachers, most of them were enthusiastic, but I recorded the children doing their pieces. I left the recorder in the room sometimes with them. And I remember the first time I took a recording home from a school and I put it on, I put my earphones in and I started listening to the recording, and I was typing up what the girls had said, and I was thinking, this is going nowhere again. This is going nowhere. I thought, you know, there's nothing here. It's boring. It's that there's no educational value in what they're doing at all. But it's only after I'd started to listen to and type up other recordings of the children, is when you start to see patterns in things. When you see, hang on a minute, those girls in that group said something about the drums, and actually those girls in a different school, in a different group, said a similar thing. And then you go back and you say, oh yeah. And then you start noticing that other kids in other groups are saying this or doing this or playing this thing in a similar way. And so that's when it gets exciting to me. And I did get very, very excited about it. It became clear that it was going to be a book. And it was whilst I was writing it, well, not writing it, gosh, I hadn't started writing it. I'd just finished the data from the first 4 schools. And Musical Futures was for us in the UK, probably also it would be for Brazil too, it was a major injection of funding by a private funder, philanthropic funder called the Paul Hamlin Foundation. They had given £1 million to a music education project. And the director of the project invited me to lead this. It was actually only 1 out of 4 elements of Musical Futures, but it's the one that has lasted. And so I led that, and I was able then to have the great support of other people. Until then, I was always a lone researcher. I just worked completely on my own. But then I had my dear friend, who you know, Heloísa, Abigail. She was called Abigail Walmsley at the time. Now she's Abigail D'Amore. She was my research assistant, and we became very good friends. We still are. And, you know, I had all the sort of paraphernalia, the administrative support of a major project around me. So that was really great.
Yeah, wonderful. We have all the topics to cover here. You know, this I just would like to hear from you. How do you see now the field of music education, sociology of music education, if you look back in the retrospective of 30 years, let's say?
Yeah.
How do you see now the field, the possibilities, the association with other realms of knowledge? How do you see these now?
I mean, let's look back more than 30 years. Let's look back to the 1970s. When I think, as I said before, Graham Vulliamy was the person to sort of bring sociology and music education together. And I'm sorry that his work isn't better known in other countries. And he wasn't a music educationist. He was a sociologist and an educationalist. But for me, his work helped to bring about that spark. And then, of course, in what was it? Help me, Heloísa. Was it 1977? Chris Small's wonderful book, Music Society Education, came out. Yeah. And that was very exciting for me. But it's important to say that Chris Small, inspiring and wonderful, lovely man, he wasn't a sociologist.
Mm-hmm.
He is often put together in sociology of education texts or other contexts, but he wasn't a sociologist. He was a musician and musicologist who combined thinking about music with thinking about music's position in society. But when we think about sociology, we think about a literature and a methodology for doing research, or several literatures and methodologies, which create what is the discipline that is called sociology. And Chris Small didn't use any of those. I mean, his sort of linking between music and society was inspired. It was, though, quite fanciful, to be honest, and sometimes based on some slightly erroneous assumptions. So the sociology of music education, you know, still wasn't getting off the ground. It still didn't exist as a subject, really, at that time. And then, of course, Keith Swanwick, who also wasn't a sociologist, but his book, Popular Music and the Teacher, came out, gosh, I think it actually must have come out before then. Even
68, wasn't it? End of 60, yeah.
Right, 68. And I mean, he doesn't present that as a sociological book either, but the thing is that popular music in the field of music education has often been associated with sociology. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because it's popular music, it's almost as though popular music is the only music that's made in society, and classical music just exists in the clouds somehow. Of course, classical music has the same status of being a socially produced object, an artifact, but because it's been so taken for granted for this very reason, unquestioned, regarded as autonomous from society, eternal, people don't consider it as part of society. And when people start saying, look, we need to look at popular music, instead of looking immediately at its musical value, as musicologists used to do with only classical music, people say, oh yes, well, we'll look at popular music from a social point of view, because it doesn't really have any value musically. So, and that's of course totally misguided. But I think that's one of the reasons how popular music has become associated with the sociology of music and music education, whereas classical music hasn't. And of course, you know, at this time, the wonderful field of ethnomusicology was developing. Blacking's work, I mean, that was published in the 1950s, wasn't it? His work on the Venda people. And actually, there are so many things in common between Blacking's anthropological work and the ethnomusicology and the sociology of music and music education. But they all grew up historically, geographically, through slightly different paths, but they all have in common the focus of looking at music in society. How does music function as a part of society? How does it affect our society? And how does our society act back and affect music? Ethnomusicology, the anthropology of music, the sociology of music, and the sociology of music education all have this fundamental focus in common. So they all grew up, as I was saying, you know, during the 60s, 70s, and then at the late 70s in the UK, Keith Swanwick and Charles Plummeridge started a Master of Music Education course, which is, of course, the course you yourself did some years later. They started it around about 1979. I would have done it. I was just graduating from my bachelor's, but you had to have at least 3 years teaching experience in a school in order to do the course. And I was bursting with enthusiasm. I just wanted to carry on studying. So I did my Masters in Music, and you know the rest. I was telling you about it earlier. So the sociology of music education has developed from there, and is now, thanks to the people I've mentioned, plus obviously Hildegard Fröhlich in the States. She's done an amazing job on bringing sociology of music and music education together, and other people who've also carried the banner, Gareth Dillon Smith. And I'm sure if I mention any more names, I will be leaving out more names than mentioning. There are many, many people now working in this field. As you know, it's got its own biannual conference, and the field is going really, really strong. I think the dangers of the field are, again, to leave behind the sociological discipline. It's quite tempting to write about something or do some research which is considering music in a social context without doing it in a sociological way. And for example, a case in point, there is another person whose work, has contributed or is often thought to have contributed to the sociology of music education, is Susan McClary, of course. And her book with Richard Leppert, which came out, you probably remember better than me, Heloísa.
I have it here. I forgot the name now. Music and Society.
Yes, it came out when, anyway, it was called Music and Society. But again, they were both musicologists, not sociologists. And so they also were linking, not actually in their case, popular music, not in that book anyway, but classical music to its social context. And that was a very exciting thing to do. But as Tia de Nora pointed out some years later, they are doing it by analyzing the music, and it's almost sort of making metaphorical analogies between, for example, the structure of music and the structure of society. And of course, Adorno, being considered at one time to be one of the fathers of the sociology of music, he did that as well. But then, of course, Tia de Nora came along and injected a massive contribution into the field of sociology of music. And she does point out that these, I mean, she doesn't say it about Christopher Small, I think, but I would add that these understandings of music in relation to a social framework, which are fantastic, but they're not always sociological, and very often they're musicological. So they give us information about how the music is working, but they don't consider what the social mechanisms of musical production, distribution, and reception are that have gone into the production of that music, its distribution, its reception, and the meanings that are associated with those things.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is so interesting. I'd like just to finish this part of you as a researcher. To conclude, your experience in supervising PhD research, PhD thesis, and your experience in IOE doing that, your experience in dealing with different cultures, because you have had so many students from different parts of the world, and then your connection with us, with Brazil. So just to finish this.
Okay, I'll take it in chronological order. So my very first PhD student was Professor Wai Chung Ho. Of course, she wasn't a professor then. She was started off as a master's student at the Institute from Hong Kong. She's Chinese Hong Kong, and she is now a very well-known, highly regarded professor of music education herself, specializing in China and Taiwan and Hong Kong issues. She was my first PhD student, and it was very exciting to work with her. Very demanding to always work with somebody from a completely different culture to oneself. Very interesting. And what I have found with all my PhD students, everybody who I've accepted to do research, there has always been that spark of light And the spark of light that I saw in Wai Chung when she was a master's student, because I'm sure she won't mind me saying this, not that she's listening, but she might come across it one day. Hello, Wai Chung, if you do. But you were very quiet, very retiring, shy person. She didn't stand out in the class. But what I realized was that she had, of her own bat, she had taken elements from the sociology master's module and connected them to what was happening in China at the time. And the time we're talking about was the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre, where the Chinese government, you'll probably remember, Heloísa, they massacred student protests and including killing some and imprisoning many others. And there was a musical culture surrounding this, particularly in Hong Kong, where Wai Chung had come from, which involved developing protest songs. And of course, these were banned in mainland China. You weren't allowed to listen to or play such songs. So Wai Chung had put together these concepts from sociology, musical meaning, social context, with that particular situation. And I thought that's absolutely fascinating. And so she became my first. And if I go through like every one of my PhD students like this, we'll be here until midnight, because I haven't had, compared to some people, I haven't had that many. I've had 25, I think, 26 PhDs I've seen to completion. I supervise them all by myself. And that's another thing that I'm very grateful for, because I think I would struggle to share supervision. I don't know what that says about me, but as you know, because you were one of them, I do like to work incredibly closely with my students, obviously some more than others, but and I find it it's a very, very intense process. The relationship between a supervisor and supervisee is sometimes almost like a therapy relationship. You get to know your students very well. You know, sometimes students, people in general, have problems in their lives, personal issues, health issues, marital issues, bereavement. And, you know, for me as a supervisor, it was always really important to know about those things, because those kinds of things affect how we work. They affect how we function. They affect how we think as well. So I've always regarded PhD supervision as a holistic thing. I mean, as I say, there have been a few students who I've been less close to than others. Maybe they were particularly autonomous or something, I don't know. But most of my students, I think I became very close to. And as with you, with Flavia from Brazil, with Jose Silva, who was only with me for 1 year. It was a sandwich course, but all of these have become close friends, very dear friends. And of course, there have been many from Brazil also who did masters with me, and I'm in touch with a lot of them. So that was a wonderful experience. And I would say all of my students had some sort of spark of light, something, reason why they wanted to do research, and they were all driven by it. They all were going to do that research, whether they got a place in a university or not. And I have always been shy of accepting a student who comes to me and says, I've got to do a PhD. I don't know what to do it on. Have you got any ideas? No. My idea to that is don't do a PhD. Don't do a PhD unless you already have an idea that is burning you up inside, and then do one.
Yeah. I must say that the experience of being supervised by you was, it's changed my life. It changed completely. And I think Flavia is the same. We talk about this once in a while. it has affected us so much, the way we teach, the way now we supervise. It's I always listen to your voice, you know, when I'm supervising some work, and then it has Lucy's voice inside. It was a big learning, and then it's a kind of trust and confidence that you build up. And then also the way you encourage us to develop our autonomous thinking, you know, and at the same time guiding us. So I must say to everybody that are listening to us here that you were a wonderful supervisor. Will be my
Heloísa.
eternal supervisor. Yes, it's such a big difference in our lives. So it's very grateful. And I speak, I think, about other students as well that feel the same. So this is a moment just to say thank you as well. That grateful feeling I have. And then just to finish this, we don't have much time, but I want to hear about your current research, because I'm not aware about what you're doing.
No, you
I know
don't.
you're doing something.
Okay, well, this is exciting. So, as I was saying, I've never looked for a research project, and when I was at the university, I'd finished those 4 books. Then I wrote my teacher's handbook, and I co-wrote with my wonderful co-author and colleague David Baker a book on visually impaired musicians' lives. That was his book. That was his spark that started it. I helped him write it. And by the time, you know, I got to near retirement age, I really was tired. I really was tired. I had very little energy. And I did say to you, I'm finished. I'm not doing any more research. Yeah. And as you know, I took emeritus status as soon as I was 60, which is when you're allowed to here. And I came to live in the countryside, miles away from any cities, airports, even trains, and change my life. And this gave me time to spend, to do more singing, which is something that I've done. I've always done singing in choirs and things, and even studied it as a soloist. And I became, when I went part-time at the university, I became very involved with a community opera company, a Baroque opera company it's now called Richmond Opera. I directed 4 of their operas. I became assistant musical director. I also sang solo roles in some of the operas. And, you know, I left all that behind when I came here, because all the lovely people that I knew in Richmond Opera and the work we'd done together, but I just thought I'm going to change my life. So I came here, I got my spinet, which you can see behind me. That's one of my 2 spinets. If you don't know that word in Portuguese, it's like a harpsichord. And I do a lot of singing and harpsichord playing. I started a madrigal group here, a little small madrigal group before COVID, of course, and have made many musical friends here. And then partly because of COVID, but actually it started before COVID, I started accompanying myself. I started singing Renaissance music and also earlier music, and accompanying myself on my spinet. And I found it really fulfilling. So I made a little CD of songs by John Dowland, songs dating from around 1600, in which he wrote them for the lute, but I accompanied myself on the spinet. And then I enjoyed it so much, when lockdown came, I made another CD, this time of Italian operatic arias from the 17th and 18th centuries, also self-accompanied. And I began to get really interested in this idea of self-accompaniment. And I came across, I was starting to look on the internet, you know, is there any research on classical singers who self-accompany? Because obviously pop singers do it, jazz singers do it, folk singers do it. They've always done it. They still do it. Nobody even thinks about it. But classical, when have I ever seen a classical singer accompany themselves? When I say classical, I mean from medieval to current day classical music. I couldn't find any research. And then I came across a wonderful thesis by a woman called Robin Beer, who is actually in the States. She did her thesis in the UK, and it was a history of classical singing with self-accompaniment. And she shows, I mean, we all know, don't we? In the court, in the home, women used to sit. We know it from novels like Jane Austen that women would sit and sing and accompany themselves. But what I didn't know until I read this thesis was that people did it at a professional level right the way through music history. The famous singers of the court of Ferrara, for example, in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, places like that, they would accompany themselves. Opera singers would accompany themselves during Renaissance and Baroque period. And this actually went on right the way through romantic, classical and romantic music. And it only died out in the 1930s. Even then, famous opera singers like Nellie Melba, a famous singer-composer like Michael Head, would perform on stage, singing and accompanying themselves. So I started to get excited. And I started to feel, I said to Charlie, my husband, oh dear, I think I feel a project coming on. He said, I told you. He's not the only one who said it. I told you. So after 3 years of total rest, this project idea has come, and we're actually, with my colleague David Baker and 2 other lovely colleagues, we're putting together a bid to look at how many classical singers today actually do accompany themselves, in what context, what they think about it, what they feel about it. And we're going to do an experiment where people will volunteer to do a song which they accompany themselves, make a recording of it, and then the same song with someone else accompanying. We're going to have a panel of judges to listen and see what differences there are musically, vocally, technically, and we're going to hopefully, if we get the money, have a conference. One of the most famous mezzo-soprano in the UK, Sarah Connolly, has agreed to be on the advisory board. The Professor of Psychology at Oxford University, Eric Clark, has agreed to be on the advisory board. We're going to work with the Guildhall School of Music, Trinity College of Music in London, and Berklee School of Music in the States. Libby Allison there has agreed to come on board. So I'm excited again. I really thought research was over for me, but I'm excited again.
Very nice.
Yes, that's it, yes.
And perhaps it will come another book later.
No. No, David can write it. I don't mind writing the foreword, but maybe an edited book, yeah.
Yeah, very nice. It's lovely to hear about that, because I remember when you said that you were done, and then you want us to sing, and then now it comes. It's in your vein. You can't avoid it.
You can't help it, it seems.
Yeah, that's nice. That's very nice. We have some question here, Lucy. Actually, and then we have here saying that we have people from a lot of universities with us. University of Brasilia, Unirio, from Sergipe, other institutions from São Paulo, Bahia, University of Pernambuco, Recife, Universidade Estadual, I don't know with this one, UEFS, Universidade de Uberlândia, many universities, Minas Gerais, Belo Horizonte, Diamantina, Juiz de Fora, Leopoldina, Alagoas, Curitiba, and countries like Peru, Portugal, and Brazil, of course. So we have about 130 people online, which is very nice. There is a question here from Arthur. Music education for teenager is a challenge. High school. How to proceed in the face of local cultural diversity?
Yeah, well, I think my answer to that is that in the very beginning of that process, the music has to come from the children. They have to be consulted and not only asked what kind of music do you want to listen to, but if at all possible, facilitate them in playing their own music, bringing their own music into the classroom, and maybe if you have no instruments for them, using body percussion, using voices, or making instruments, and getting inside that music by trying to play it orally, by ear, with their friends. And from this begin to develop basic musical skills, the most basic ones, but some of those basic skills are ones which we have left behind in classical music education, and particularly the ability to listen to something and play it by ear. So that's a basic skill which is aided by this process and which is missing from classical music education. But there is also, you know, keeping in time, listening to other people in the group, keeping in tune. They start improvising through this process very, very early. They often sing. So there are many, many musical skills that are being employed, even at the most basic level, if the children or the teenagers, the adolescents are asked to choose their own music and teach themselves to play it. And the thing is, once that process starts, they begin to develop musical skills. And from there, the teacher can start to build outwards in whatever direction the teacher in that particular context feels is the direction to go in. I don't know if that helps you with your question at all, but that's the first answer that comes to my mind.
Yeah, great. There's another question from Elsa Nadia Oliveira da Rocha. How do you see the research relations between musicology and music education?
Ah, yes, that's an interesting one too. When I was young, they didn't talk to each other. Musicology and music education didn't have any areas of overlap. And I think, to be honest, musicologists would look down on music educationalists. Musicologists thought that music educationalists were musicians who had failed, who just taught children very simple things, that the job wasn't really interesting, etc., etc. And actually, music education seemed, we have this word in English, stuffy. I don't know how to translate that, Heloísa, but music education seemed a bit of a stuffy field, like it was a bit old-fashioned, you know, that kind of thing. And musicology seemed a much more exciting field. But I went into music education nonetheless, as I told you why and how. But then I think the situation has really changed radically. Now music education is at one of the cutting edges. Music education is really on it, as we say. Music education is thinking about inclusivity, equality of opportunity, human rights, gender, race issues, sexuality issues, minority ethnic issues, privilege, and all these kinds of things which are really exciting. And I mean, in any circumstance. And musicology also has come around to these things. Musicologists are also interested in these kinds of issues nowadays, not so much in the musical score, which is, you know, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, it was really the musical score and the history of how that score and the performance of it and the composition of it developed. But now, so much broader musicological interests. And so I think there's a much bigger crossover. There's respect between the two fields, and it's very exciting. I think the boundaries between a lot of subjects, not just in music actually, but many subjects, boundaries are becoming fuzzy and blurred. Although it's important that we do all keep a knowledge of the history of our disciplines and our disciplinary and methodological bases, at the same time, it's healthy to look out from our discipline and into others.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Another question from Alan, your grandson.
Oh, Alan, hello.
Alan, because we say this, that I'm your daughter, and then he's one of my student. He finished his PhD last year. He's your grandson. He asks, could you talk a little bit about your connection with Paulo Freire's work?
Ah, yes, there's a great question. Well, I would say when I first came up to know about Paulo Freire's work, Freire's work, I can't remember exactly when it was actually, but I found a huge connection with it. And of course, his work is very Marxist. It's if you read Karl Marx, as I did when I was doing my PhD, very, very seriously, for I gave myself a course in Marx. I read all of his main texts extremely carefully. And of course, if you do that and then you read Freire, as I'm sure many of you have, you can see that Freire's work is very, very Marxian. Maybe we would call it not Marxist, not communist, but Marxian, socialist in the best sense of the word. So I was very much influenced by Marxist and Marxian issues. Marx himself, the writings of the Frankfurt School in Germany during the 1930s, and then they escaped and continued their work. And obviously there is this very deep root in Freire's work as well. Mm-hmm. I was also influenced when I was at college, actually. I don't know if Ivan Illich's work is well known in Brazil. He wrote a book called Deschooling Society, and it often is connected with pedagogy of the oppressed. I can't even remember whether Illich was, what country he came from, but his was the book that I happened to come across first when I was much younger. And it's called Deschooling Society, and it's all about how it was prophetic, you know, because there was no idea in anybody's mind at that time that there could ever be such a thing as the internet. But he was suggesting that we should close schools and that schooling should be in the hands of the people, that school should be somewhere you don't have to go to, you only go to if you choose to, that schooling is a lifelong activity and so forth. Many of these things kind of in common with Freire's work as well. And I came across that and the pedagogy of the oppressed roughly at the same time. So I've been so thrilled, honored and flattered that some people in Brazil have connected my work with Freire's work. That to me is just the biggest compliment I could possibly have. It wasn't a connection that I made myself. It never occurred to me, to be honest.
Yeah, so he did. Alan did.
Alan did. Flavia has done. Other people are doing as well.
Flavia, yes, was the first to do this. Yes, yeah. That's wonderful. Another question from Leticia. Lucy, how do you see the usage of medieval and Renaissance repertoires in non-formal contexts of music teaching for amateur audience of different ages?
Oh, well, that, you know, that really touches a heartstring for me, because as I was mentioning in my own life as a musician and as a community musician, has all been in Renaissance and some Baroque music, and also medieval music, as it happens. And I am a very, very, very basic player of the hurdy-gurdy, which that's an instrument. I don't know if you have. You'll have
Viela de roda. I think it's viela de roda.
Yeah, it's like you can't see, but it's got a handle. You wind the handle like this, and it turns a wheel which bows the strings, and then you have finger things. Anyway, it goes back to the medieval times. In the medieval times, this instrument was called a symphony, and I've got one of these. I'm I'm not a proper player of it, but I have a band. We sometimes do medieval music together. And since I got down here, I've met some other medieval musicians, and we do things like I've played in Worcester Cathedral at a medieval pageant and so forth. I accompany my singing on the hurdy-gurdy. So to get back to your question, it's an absolutely brilliant kind of music to use with amateurs, adults and children and teenagers, people of all ages. And of course, one of the things that this, especially medieval music, has in common with current day popular music is that it's not really properly written down, if you don't mind me saying it like that. You know, there might just be a scrap of a tune. And if you get together with other musicians, you have to make up the other bits, or you have to decide how many times will you play this, and then I'll come in, you play it. Why don't we put this in the bass? Shall we have a drum? It's more like popular music, isn't it? And it's very, very accessible music. And I know in this country, and probably in Brazil as well, I know in the States too, there's a very, very big, all over Europe, there's probably all over, everywhere, there's a big amateur music movement which involves medieval and Renaissance music, partly because it's accessible, it's adaptable. It doesn't matter if you have a meeting, let's say an amateur orchestra, and half the people don't turn up. So you thought you were going to have maybe a bassoon, and there is no bassoon. It doesn't matter. You can have a bass viol. If there's no bassoon and no bass viol, you do something else. It's very adaptable. So it's very useful in so many situations.
Mm-hmm. That's nice. Another question. What do you think about the music education in the remote? No, sorry, it's another one. I missed one. Could you talk a little bit about how you see this current context of the pandemic, which has so drastically changed the reality of teaching and learning in relation to the practice of music education?
I'm full of admiration for all those practicing teachers who have found ways, and also choir directors, orchestra directors, band directors, who have found ways to keep their musical activities going for their students and for their community participants during the COVID. I think the human being, although we humans are destroying this planet at the moment, so it seems, and we have destroyed ourselves and each other many times in history, but one thing that can always be said for human beings is that if we have a problem, we are very creative in finding ways around it. And I'm full of admiration to all those people who have developed ways of singing together online, communal online singing, teaching online, as well as, of course, having conferences like this one online. So I can only say that the COVID lockdown doesn't seem to have completely stopped communal music making or music education activities. Those things are still going on, and I think that's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, and continue with the same topic. How do you think about the music education, the remote context of learning that's happening now? Is it a step in the direction to the future of the relationships between teachers and students?
Well, this is obviously going to be something that becomes the topic of many researches, I think. I don't have a way of predicting the future, but my supposition is that it will change the way that music teaching and learning is accessed and distributed across the world. It will open up many opportunities for many people to teach and learn in settings that they wouldn't have been able to access otherwise. And as I said, I think there's going to be a lot of research on it. Funnily enough, well, it's not funny, but it's to me, it's sort of coincidentally that the last book I wrote, the one that was David Baker's project on visually impaired musicians' lives and learning, visually impaired musicians are really on technology. They use technology a huge amount. They have all sorts of accessible ways of using a computer. They can send emails, they can write and read emails, they can connect with each other virtually online, they can play instruments, and they've been doing this for quite some time and exploring blind musicians, exploring ways of teaching and working as a musician by using distance technology, learning and so forth. And part of the reason for that is that if you're, say, you're blind or visually impaired, you want to be a music teacher, it's very difficult sometimes to get on a bus, to go to a place of work. It's much better to do it from home in some cases. Mm-hmm. And a lot of visually impaired musicians have been doing this. And in a sense, I think they are already ahead of the game when it comes to online teaching and learning and online music making.
Mm-hmm. And there is a question from Andrea. How do you think the deaf subjects' relationship with music in music education? How do you think deaf subjects related with music in music education? Not sure about I don't know.
Not sure. Could you read that again? I'm not sure I followed.
Yeah. How do you think the deaf subjects' relationship with music in music education?
Are you talking about deaf? D-E-A-F?
Yes.
Deaf. Oh, sorry. I thought you said deaf. More.
No, not to die. Not to hear.
I've never done any work on people with hearing impairment issues and music. I came across some people very recently, actually. Gosh, I'm sorry, I've forgotten their name, but it was a woman in Australia and a man, I can't remember exactly where, but they are doing some work on music education for children with hearing impairment and adults and teenagers with hearing. And I was absolutely astonished to see some videos of hearing impaired people singing, playing instruments. I mean, I know there are famous people like Evelyn Glennie, the deaf percussionist. She's a genius, absolute genius, and I've never understood it. And these videos that I was shown by these colleagues were really inspiring, showing that deaf people can benefit hugely from musical engagement. But I myself, I can't say anymore. I've never done any work on that.
Mm-hmm. So one more from Hermilo Santana. Do you see some kind of connection between the sociology of music education and music therapy, especially when working with groups?
Wow, that's something I've never thought of. Let me think about that. Between the sociology of music education and music therapy, or maybe between pedagogy. Perhaps I could answer an association between music pedagogy, which is drawn from a sociological framework. Okay, so like informal learning and music therapy. I think there probably are some really interesting associations there. One thing that they would both share in common is that teaching music in a way which emphasizes inclusivity, experience, process, enjoyment, these things characterize sociologically invested teaching approaches. These things are put as more important as goals than actually achieving just musical skills, right? The point of the lesson is not just for the children to gain increased musical skills, but that is one of the aims of the lesson, but it's not the main aim, actually, in many cases, especially when working with very deprived children. And also in music therapy, as far as I understand it, the aim is not to give children musical skills, or children or adults, whoever, musical skills for the sake of themselves, but the aim is to increase and to benefit and develop the participants' broader understanding of themselves, their ability to communicate with another person, and so forth. So I would say that one thing that music therapy and sociologically inspired pedagogy have in common is an emphasis on the value of the process rather than the product of music education. And this is an area where research would be really interesting, actually.
Yeah. Okay, 2 more questions and then we finish, right? Otherwise, we're going to stay the rest of the day. A question from José Alberto Salgado.
Hi, José.
Yes, it's inspiring to hear you, as usual, Lucy. Many thanks. Would you like to share your views on doing sociological work in higher education in relation to a contemporary context of post-truth?
Oh, false truth.
Post-truth.
This concept that has recently come about, stemming from certain beloved presidents of certain countries and other things. Is that what he's talking about? Gosh, that was a long question, Loli. Please, could you read it again?
Would you like to share your views on doing sociological work in higher education in relation to a contemporary context of post-truth?
Okay, well, I've never thought about this question, José, but I would say one of the things about sociology, and indeed any related study, philosophy, for example, politics, economics. Well, I don't know so much about economics, so I'll leave that one out. But any advanced study, right, in university teaches people to interrogate evidence, to look for the sources of knowledge, to question people's motives for saying things, for espousing things. And so that will lead to an ability to critically analyze what is being put forward as truth. And where false truths are being perpetrated, almost like viruses going through our world, a lot of the time the people who are caught, who catch those viruses have, I think they have missed out on a certain level of education where they were shown how to, or led into the knowledge of how to weigh up evidence against other evidence. And so how would this affect teaching in higher education? I think it wouldn't affect it, because we've always taught in higher education, we've always taught people to think critically about what they're learning, to find out where the sources are, to check a range of different sources for pieces of knowledge. So it wouldn't make any change to me, but it just makes me feel it's even more important that we don't lose these skills and these approaches to acquiring knowledge at this particular stage in history. That would just be the end, really.
José just said something else. My question on post-truth should really mention conservative discourses as well.
Yes, I think I understood that. Yeah. And I had misunderstood the question, because I thought you said false truth rather than post-truth, because there is an expression false truth going around as well. So, but post-truth, I guess, has many things in common with that. As you know, José, I'm very strongly of the opinion that what we take to be truth is always relative. So every truth that we accept as being true is a post-truth, in a sense, because there's always been a different truth that went before it. So we must always be cautious of what we accept as truth, all of us as human beings.
Mm-hmm. And the last one.
Okay.
From Fernando Rodrigues. You know him as well.
Hi, Fernando. Yes.
In your opinion, do you think there are more different topics about informal learning to be researched?
Oh, yes. Loads. Loads. I mean, my own work, as you know, was limited to informal learning amongst basically Anglo-American popular musicians. It was done before the internet was a widespread phenomenon. Chris Kayari at this moment is looking into actually not really how musicians learn on the internet, but how they are using the internet to exchange learning and teaching and knowledge and music. So informal learning through the internet is I know apart from Chris Kayari, there are many other people, Lauri Vakeva and others too, who are looking at informal learning through the internet. But there remain a lot of areas there. And then, of course, many ethnomusicologists are looking at informal learning in a array. I mean, they've always, in a sense, looked at informal learning, but ethnomusicologists have maybe not focused so much on learning as other aspects of music in the social context that they're studying. I think there are more ethnomusicologists now who are interested specifically in learning. And so, I mean, you can look at how people learn music in any context, not just, you know, including classical music, actually, because a lot of classical musicians also have many informal aspects to their learning. And actually, one of my students, Tim Smart, is looking at that and has written we together wrote a very, I say his work is very interesting. We wrote a chapter in a recent book, I think edited by John Rink, about informal learning processes in classical music. So I think the answer, a one-word answer to the question is yes.
Many.
Many.
Yeah. Okay, let me see if there's something else. No, it's okay. I think we have to close this now.
Yes.
I think we'd love to stay with you hours and hours. And actually, I would love, and I think many of us would love to have you here with us in Brazil in the future.
Yeah,
whenever this pandemic, ends, you are most welcome to come again and to be with us. And I know you like Brazil. And
you know, Heloísa, me and my husband Charlie often say we don't want to get in an aeroplane and go anywhere else ever again. But if there was one place we would go to, it would be Brazil.
Ah, good.
I left a little piece of my heart in Rio de Janeiro, and it's
yeah. Yes. So, well, I think we should close now. Thank you so much.
We do a virtual hug. This is a virtual hug to everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry I can't see your faces. I would have loved to. And good luck with everything.
Thank you so
Goodbye.
much. Thank you, Lucy. And I'll speak with you again soon.
Yeah.
Thank you for the people from the conference, Vinicius, Ajit. Thank you so much for this.
Yes, sorry, I did say thank you to them at the beginning, but I would like to repeat that thanks now for making this possible and for inviting me. It's such an honor and a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all, all the public audience. See you.
Bye. I'm going now. Hang on.
Bye-bye.
I never know how to do this. Here we go.